Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to kick off the webinar series for the 5th Siena Conference on the future of Europe. I can't believe it's the 5th conference already. And this is the first webinar, and the title is an old theme that has been with us for a while, the paradox of democracy and efficiency. Can we make Europe both more inclusive and fast-moving? And I'll introduce the speakers briefly, the speakers of today. Of course, first and foremost, Francesco Grillo, founder of Vision think tank, will give an introduction to the topic. Then Sabrina Cavatorto from the University of Siena will also come in with her ideas about democracy and efficiency. Calypso Nikolaidis from the European University will speak to us, and then we will have discussants, and I will introduce them later. So the floor is yours, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I hope you can all hear me. And well, first of all, let me say that, well, number one, I'm trying to share my couple of slides. But let me say that the title is slightly to be corrected, because we changed the name of the conference. It's not any longer the Conference on the Future of Europe, also because, as Calypso very much knows, the Conference on the Future of Europe is dead. So it is called now the Conference on the Europe of the Future. And this is also to make clear the sort of scale in terms of change that Europe has in front of itself. So let me quickly share with you. Okay, you see it, no? I think. And okay, so it's the 5th conference on the Europe of the future. And these are a little bit the distinctiveness of Vision Siena conferences with an S, because in fact it's not just this conference, but also the one on climate change and artificial intelligence, which more or less follow the very same format. So the conference, it is a platform for problem setting and problem solving, as we are keep saying very much. And just to define it more easily, a contrario, let's say, it is not an academic conference. This is very important to underline for everybody, because we have quite a number of academics. And even less a convegno. A convegno is a complete waste of time that we very much are used to in Italy. Secondly, this is probably the point of strength this very year. All 5 political foundations of the 5 big political parties that most likely would have to find a common agenda, an unprecedented common agenda coalition, will be partners of the conference. So will be very multi-partisan, and they cannot exclude that these political parties will strike some deal in Siena, no? Mid-September. We are putting together different worlds, so companies, media, academics, which are very much available to work with an interdisciplinary approach, so not in their silos, and policymakers. And we will have almost all EU countries. We will have 80 participants, with a strong gender balance and hopefully low average age, plus people from outside the EU. Of course, UK, quite many journalists from there, but also people from Africa. We have people from USA, from Australia, from China. It is a project, not just a conference, that started before with students and tutors framing the problem setting, problem solving groups. and will continue afterwards with the advocacy and the development of the ideas that we will have in the Pontignano paper. And basically the project starts today with this first webinar that will be followed by other three. I'm not going into the slides on democracy because we do not have time, and we'll pass the word to Sabrina immediately. Now, let me just say that we decided to start with this webinar 2 days before the EU election because democracy is a very fundamental part of the entire story on the Europe of the future. And it is very much neglected, you know. I saw yesterday night there was an interview to the Presidente del Consiglio, l'Italian Presidente del Consiglio, Giorgia Meloni, who, by the way, happens to be the potential queen maker after the election. And she mentioned only once the word Europe. Only to say that it is a bad idea to talk about war during an electoral campaign on Europe. This is not a problem of Giorgia Meloni, or at least it's not a problem of Giorgia Meloni only. We have forms of participation and even the electoral law that very much is completely dysfunctional for something that we want to become bigger and stronger because of the very basic law of democracy, which is not taxation without representation. So we need to completely change the entire forms through which we govern and participate to the EU. So that's why we are starting from democracy. I think, Sabrina, the floor is yours, and let me interrupt sharing here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Francesco. So now let me check, can you hear me? So yes, okay, the audio is on. Thank you very much, I mean, for this last remark also, because actually this was one of the major thought I had when reflecting about how associate, I mean, these words that are democracy, European Union, and the future, in a sense that, first of all, I thought that if we think about the Europe of the future, as you said, that will be at the very core of this fifth conference in September, it's hard not to wonder what the future of democracy in the European Union might be. So therefore, as in some sense, democracy has been for a long time linked to sovereignty, and national sovereignty, is hard nowadays not to link democracy with the European Union. I mean, in my view, but this can be to some extent a very personal opinion. Anyhow, we know that in this framework, you know, the position of national politicians is undoubtedly at the very core. It's very important. So therefore, even if we are here to elaborate about possible new forms of democratic participation in the EU, especially, my point is that we cannot neglect, I mean, the role that still politicians are expected to play. So therefore, indeed, notwithstanding we think about innovation and possibly new developments, I mean, again, and so far we must continue to think that democracies is actually linked to a component that is also its own representative phase. So to some extent, even if when thinking to further developments, I think that the role of representatives, I mean, should be in some sense reflected, still reflected. So what our Prime Minister says or does not say is in some sense important. But having stressed this point, yes, I mean, we know that democracy is in trouble worldwide. It's therefore difficult to imagine that it can function without criticism within the EU. So this must be taken as for granted. For sure, we know that the challenges for democratic regimes in the context of globalization have been more than widely debated, as far as the issue of democratic deficit in the EU also has been subject of much controversial reflection. However, despite all of these and the weaknesses experienced by democratic regimes, it's recognized that the development of high levels of democratic standards is paramount for improving the well-being and prosperity of society. So here we stand. Especially as far as the EU is concerned, we know from the Lisbon Treaty that again, democracy is a foundational principle, and it has been operationalized, we must say, through concrete mechanism and citizens' rights. So this is, a budget that we should remember and again stress in its importance, in my view. So in some sense, the EU, even formally, has stated that it is aimed at ensuring both a representative and a participatory phase of democracy at multiple levels of the EU system. So therefore, again, we should even consider that the multi-level structure of EU governance undoubtedly adds complexity to its democratic system. So that's the baseline, I say. So challenges are evident both in how political representatives are elected and how citizens are involved in decision-making processes. So therefore, an electoral and a policy dimension impact how democracy function in the EU, how it is legitimated, and how its governance system is effective. So on the one hand, we know that we do have problems when thinking to the electoral dimension. That is the reason why, together with the students of my group, we thought that the electoral participation should be, without any doubt, a component of our reflection. But on the other hand, reflecting about the future of democracy in the EU involve the development of a reasoning about engagement in policy making. So we think that in some sense, an evidence-based EU democracy is an idea that should be further detailed and elaborated. And we hope that a conference could be even, could do the good framework where thinking about this. So we believe that addressing the problem of democracy, to put it strictly, in the EU entails the consideration of the closely related dimensions of electoral participation and engagement in policy making. So we think that the policy dimension is important. Also because when mentioning representatives, we know that they mainly talk, when they do, about Europe during electoral campaigns, if any. Now, so and this is a weakness that I find is important when reflecting about missing point in the connection between domestic and supranational arenas. And I think that is important for citizens. So by saying so, and I stop for the moment, simply let me introduce you that what the component of the group developed so far has been mainly related to the topics linked to electoral participation. So they were, for the moment, mainly curious about this controversial idea of transnational lists to encourage a pan-European perspective among voters and candidates too, because we also discovered that, this is something that only a few politicians think to be important, but we think that we should further, again, elaborate on this route. Making voting as easy as possible would certainly help. Therefore, this is the reason why, digital issues has been linked to the possibility to make voting simpler, especially for young generation. What else? For the moment, this is the contribution that we can add to the webinar. On the other hand, we further elaborate on engagement in EU policy making. And yes, on this, let me say that we think that the inadequate involvement of national institutional actors in EU affairs is an additional weakness of representative democracy in the EU. And this has been proved because of the lack of engagement of members of the national parliaments, for instance, notwithstanding what the Lisbon Treaty said about making them part of the decision-making process. So we think that on the one hand, it is true that the enrichment of democratic processes within the EU, for instance, through deliberative mechanism, can be, again, a way to innovate forms of participation, but we also were thinking about the possibility that mainly this should be strengthened by including those institutional actors that are closer to the citizens, that are local communities in some sense. So we thought to some example, for instance, in the field of climate policy, that is at the very core of interest, especially of young people. But I do not want to say anything more on this. I stop, and if there's would be the space, I would add some additional details. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Sabrina, striking the right balance between representation and participation, and engagement is what you've been working on, speaking for the University of Siena. Now Calypso has the floor. Calypso Nicolaides, European University, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and great to see you, Sabrina, and everyone on this webinar who's thinking so hard about political issues, which we're all going to know more about on Sunday. So it's a really key moment. Well done, Francesco, in the timing. This makes a lot of sense. I'll try to be really short in starting with this tension that visions kind of set for this moment. The tension between democracy and efficiency, simply to say that this is a superficial tension. It's a tension that has been with us in political science, but also in political discourse forever, that, democracy is messy, takes a lot of time, you need to consult everyone. And us technocrats, politicians, heads of state, sorry, guys, we've got to take decisions fast. So democracy is a luxury. And that's kind of the baseline against which we want to push. Because, of course, first of all, efficiency it shouldn't be about emergency. What we've known again and again in the EU in the last 10 years, but before, of course, is that when you deal with issues of emergency in an emergency way, which is without thinking about the longer term, you are not efficient, because you're not creating sustainable solutions. If we had dealt with the financial crisis early on in a sustainable way, with migration, with COVID, with the relationships with Russia, all of these require to think it is urgent to act long-term. So efficiency is about long-term and not emergency, is the first point. So the false paradox. But then we need to replace this false paradox, which simply is all about the need to shift to the politics of time. I like to say that the EU is at a moment where it needs to shift from the politics of space to the politics of time. But in doing so, and I'm echoing some of what Sabrina said, we have to see that our democracy seem to be in a paradox, what Albina Asmanova and I call the paradox of democratic time. That even if we turn to democratic ways of doing, the multiple ways of democratic ways of doing, it is true that democracies and the publics are afflicted often by a tunnel vision, myopia, we have to we have to kind of do things quickly at all levels. We are in the here and now. But at the same time, so that means that our future are really chained, the prisoner of our really anxious present. But on the other hand, there is a growing awareness, and again, by everyone, but including by publics. Because Tocqueville used to say, publics are short-term, elites are long-term. Well, it's not true. Elites are increasingly worried about the long-term. There's a whole new set of institutions and regulation in the EU in the last 3 years, 4 years about foresight and acting in the long term. That is true. But the public opinions show that people understand that we need to act in a future-focused way and planetary way, issues that Visions has discussed a lot, that problem solving, the way you framed it, Francesco, requires, if we're going to safeguard nature, harness the digital revolution, fight poverty, etc., prevent war, all of this means that we have to have this ambitious, radical, transformative action. And people are on board as long as there's distributive justice in doing so, right? It's not an opposition to the long term. And that's the paradox of democratic time. There's two pools of short-term and long-term. And we can all agree or argue at least that democracies are uniquely capable of harnessing the collective intelligence that it takes to do all the things that Vision is all about, and that we will discuss again in Pontignano. But then once we've said that, then the question is, what are the different means to harness this? Because it's, as usual in social science, we need to ask under what conditions? How do you do this? And so first of all, there is the election frame that Sabrina was talking about. And we are witnessing this kind of democratic gap in elections between what parties and politicians talk about and how the people see it. We can talk more about this. Just going to leave it at this, but also, of course, asking to what extent within elections we're talking about what should happen between elections in terms of accountability, in terms of citizens' involvement, citizen initiatives, assemblies, all these lovely things. And Sabrina started talking about this too. But secondly, then what about the substance? Sabrina, you said, well, what we really want in the EU is evidence-based decision-making just now. And I agree with you, but would you agree with me that what needs to supplement evidence-based is imagination-inspired decision-making? We need all of us and all of our public space to imagine other futures, because you can't really transform if you don't imagine, or else you're completely anchored to the status quo. You can still be incremental, say cautiously incremental, but you need to appeal to our collective imagination too. And these two things are not in contradiction, absolutely not. And finally, and this is how I want to think about involving citizens' assemblies in our project, The Democratic Odyssey. We are committed to imagining an EU with a fourth branch of government, a standing citizen assembly that wouldn't depend on the whims and desires of politicians or bureaucracies, but instead would exist permanently in Europe and trigger citizens' imagination and inspiration that they can write themselves in the EU story. Because what we are seeing now and what the abstention will show on Sunday is that people do not write themselves in the EU story. This is how I define democracy, or one of the many ways I define democracy, is the propensity of people to write themselves in the collective story, and in this case, the European story. So we need to find ways in which they will do that. And this is one way. It's not a magic wand, but such a permanent assembly would be one way. And of course, I will continue to advocate in this space, Francisco, the way we want to do it, which is through a proof of concept, pilot assembly, trying to demonstrate how this can happen in all sorts of different ways. But let me finish by saying that in saying all of this, let's not forget the underlying reason why we have the paradox of democratic time, this tension between short-term anxiety and long-term ambition that everyone has. They don't depend on different groups. And that's because we live in a time, as Albina would say, of widely distributed precarity, people having a sense that their own lives, their own income, their own capacity to live a decent life is precarious, because that's the stage of capitalism that we have reached in today's world, a capitalism of precarity, an extractive capitalism that doesn't give stability and togetherness and public goods to the huge majority of us. And so if we're going to talk democracy, there is no way we can seriously talk democracy if we don't talk about economic structure at the local, national, and global level, and the ways in which they might be attuned to the real need of people. So all of these things come together in this way. And I think Visions on one hand and our Pontignano conference is a great space to further these thoughts and ambitions.
Thanks a lot, Calypso. That's a good reminder that we don't only need evidence-based, fast and efficient decision-making, but also inspiration and imagination, and actually also that democracy is not a luxury, but a precondition for actually sustainable decision-making, really. Thanks a lot. And now I will introduce our three discussants. And there we have Franziska Meyer from University of Stuttgart. We have Joe Elburn from the Even Foundation, and we have Sim Espenberg from the University of Tartu. And Franziska, the floor is yours.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and for this exciting webinar and the exciting plans that you've presented. I have three, perhaps thoughts or considerations on what Sabrina and Calypso have now presented and spoken about. The first is what I find really interesting is that you bring up both of these points of an evidence-based and a more imagination-based creative way of designing the future of Europe. And I think perhaps a way to unite those two things is to focus a little bit more on actually asking citizens and ordinary citizens about how they imagine the future of Europe. Because in political science, we have quite a lot of research about how people imagine the future of national democracy and how they would improve democracy there. But I think we don't have enough actually on how people imagine global and European democracy. And perhaps there is often this excuse also of saying this is too complicated for ordinary citizens to make a contribution to. But I think it's kind of up to us to break it down and make it possible to understand what different models of European democracy could look like, and actually put more effort into learning about what citizens would prefer there. And I think this could then even be a contribution to what Francesco had in his slide in the beginning of making a third way between federalist and sovereignist visions of Europe, right? So something that's not just national member states, because that's impossible to go back to, but perhaps also something that's more creative or something else than the federalist vision of Europe that there has been, that adds some of the components that many of you have now mentioned. The second really interesting thing, I think, is how to improve on this engagement component. You talked already about how to make electoral democracy more accessible. I think it's worth a lot of consideration and discussion about how to get citizens engaged in policy making and how to do this well. We've seen some attempts in the EU and the Conference of the Future of Europe, as you mentioned in the beginning, etc. And I think there's a few things to think about to make that effective. One would be that, and perhaps this is what you mean with engagement really in policy, that citizen participation is actually on issues that will matter and make a real difference to people's lives. So I think actually these economic dimensions are a great example, that we talk about redistribution or economic minima in the EU to secure people's lives. These are very high stakes issues, but I think if we're serious about citizens' participation, then we need to also have them about these high stakes issues and not just smaller issues. And I think what would be very appealing in a standing citizens assembly that you've proposed would be that we don't actually have citizens' participation only on individual issues where then policymakers can decide, this is perhaps an issue we can give to the citizens. But there's also the possibility for citizens to set the agenda and to actually bring up topics that matter to them. And I think this would be really important for actually making a more inclusive European democracy as well. And as a last point, I think for a permanent citizens assembly, perhaps we can use this as an example because it's maybe the most radical. I think it would also be important to think about how we can actually make it inclusive in reality rather than just on paper, if that makes sense. There's a lot of, a bit of research perhaps rather from Belgium, where they do have a standing citizens assembly, and quite often it's a certain type of person who defers their invitation to participate in the citizens assembly, perhaps because they say, I don't know enough about politics, I'm not eloquent enough, etc. So how can we make sure that on the European level, if we had something like this, it wouldn't be a forum where those who are already active or who already lobby quite a lot on the EU level dominate these arenas, so that there is no capture but real bottom-up citizen participation? I don't have a great answer to that, but I think it's worth thinking about. So those are my initial thoughts, but very exciting ideas, I think, to discuss further.
Thanks a lot, Franziska. This is really, absolutely challenging, being imaginative about global democracy or supranational democracy. Now I'll give the word to Joe Elbron. Please, Joe, your thoughts on this, what's been said so far.
I'm going to find it difficult. That was an expensive scope, right? I'll try and be somewhat provocative then. I'm unconvinced by wanting to get citizens involved in everything political all the time, right? Do they really want to be? And as I speak a little bit on behalf of the foundation community, who are putting lots of money into citizens' assemblies and participatory democracy and all these kinds of things, and I get slightly nervous that it's a chimera, it's a blind alley. And I'm of the view that actually what we need much more is to create senses of belonging and senses of community, rather than necessarily involve everyone in political process, as just a contentious thought starter. And then, I've been involved in lots of different ways with this kind of concept of a permanent citizens assembly. I come from Ireland, so I've seen both sides of it. Some kind of incredible outcomes in Ireland in terms of gay right to marriage and abortion, but also some absolute shit shows. What just happened a few months ago, where they refused to change the constitution. So I'm again quite skeptical of it. And I guess my other question is, so it's nice that we wanted to these radical new things and put them in, which would take forever in the European setup, right? But we do have an institution that exists that could be reformed to play this role, and that's the European Economic and Social Committee. And should we not look at what we have already, which is a form of assembly, rather than trying to recreate something? Meaningfully engaging every single, a meaningful number of citizens in policy, I just think is a bit far stretched. So my challenge is, should we not be focusing on creating senses of community and senses of belonging, whatever that means, rather than trying to involve everyone in politics? Thing one. Reflection two, and I'll finish with it, or no, one other tiny point, but reflection two, it's interesting. I do a lot of work with engaging young people in politics and political process. And it's quite interesting, if you look at the polling, there's obviously mass dissatisfaction with this concept of democracy, right? You're sort of seeing 65% of young people saying we're dissatisfied with democracy, whatever that is. But then if you break that up, you get a completely different picture. If you go, are you satisfied with the freedom of the media? Are you satisfied with one person, one vote? Are you satisfied with the division of power? They all go, they go up to 80, 90%. Yeah, we're actually quite satisfied, and that thing's quite important. So there's a really big gap between people's response to the question of, are you satisfied with democracy, and the bits of democracy whenever you break it out. And one of my big questions is, what is that gap? And I think perhaps the answer speaks to one of the points earlier, which is maybe it's not about democracy that people are dissatisfied, it's about something else. And maybe that something else is profoundly linked to neoliberal economics. But again, I want to also underline that I think also people use the word capitalism, and I think that's not necessarily true. There's been really incredible results from capitalism. If you look in the 1960s and the 1970s, they were golden years in the US and in much of Europe, and much of smaller Europe. And so capitalism can do really powerful, quite impressive social change and social good. It's maybe just this current form of neoliberalism which has gone a bit wrong. And I think those debates maybe get a little confused. And then my very final kind of reflection is, again, coming back to that kind of, that we need to create new things, we need to engage citizens more, we need to is fine, but the thing I'm missing, I guess, is this question about how the digital space is playing into all this. And I think, again, someone else mentioned this a little bit. But without sorting that piece out, it's very difficult to imagine anything working, because it's so fundamentally changed how we consume our information, our attention, the way we interact. And you mean, I was part of lots of discussions about how do we digitize European democracy a bit more, and everyone gets super scared of things getting hacked and all sorts of other. It seems impossible to get anything meaningful done. But I don't know if that's just going to be a constant stumbling block or what an answer could be. Anyway, those are 3 completely random thoughts on a very wide bit of content. So I hope that was in some way interesting, but also totally fine if not.
Well, thanks for being provocative, Joe. That is, I have a journalism background, and actually that's the same thinking. Like, because many people think like if we do the right news, then people will come. But actually, isn't it an obligation to actually just go to where the people are and meet them there? And you mentioned the sense of community. So it's not necessarily said if you build the right institutions, people will do it. So starting from the user needs perspective is probably important. Sim, you will probably talk about the digital a little bit now. Sim Espenberg from Tartu University. So I'll give you the floor to you.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, well, coming from Estonia, it's kind of imperative to talk about digital stuff. And what I would like to bring on the table is, kind of a use case, if you will, how to maybe improve participation of people in the elections. And as you most probably know, in Estonia, for almost 20 years, we have used e-voting. And I'll quickly give a background to it, and then I just before going to that, I'll just mention that I'm not going to say that it's the perfect solution to everything or something like that. There are of course advantages, but there are also challenges with that. So, but we can discuss that if you like. Anyway, yeah, since 2005, Estonia has used e-voting, and to cut the story short, during these almost 20 years, the e-voting usage has steadily increased. We use it on local elections, parliamentary elections, and now at the moment also, well, the elections of the European Parliament are ongoing. And for example, just a few days ago, I gave my vote also online. So that's very regular at the moment. And for example, last year when we had our last parliamentary elections, about 50% of the votes cast were done online. So this is kind of a background. Now, regarding the advantages that also somehow connect to what has been discussed already today. This gives, obviously, this technological solution gives, obviously, some adds more convenience or accessibility for the voters, and what we have seen through the statistics, the participation through online voting has been increasing, not only in the younger age groups, but also among older people. So that's also an important maybe thing to keep in mind. But very shortly also about the challenges. I mean, what has been quite clear is that you cannot do that if you don't have like a very strong trust, within the society, and especially towards the let's say government or towards the state. If you don't have that, then it's very, very difficult to set it up. And what I can say is that also, in Estonia, I don't know, during the last few years, when there have been many crises everywhere, there have been, lot of putting it to the test, because, for example, parties that are maybe less popular among those people who are more prone to use online voting, they try to find ways how to undermine e-voting and so on and so forth. But well, what I can say in Estonia's case is that since we started with that quite some time ago, and then there was this, the trust was strong, and the security measures and all that has been in place. So even when there are polarizing issues in the society, it hasn't been it hasn't undermined e-voting, and it has still grown and is used a lot. So just this kind of an example, concrete idea to use, and happy to discuss or give ideas here more.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, small countries have been known for being very innovative because they have this lab style character that maybe in a big country that's much more bureaucratic and hierarchical, whatever, is much more difficult to do. So who of the students would like to ask questions here now? Is there anyone?
Well, if I may, I would encourage, both Celine and also Leonora, that were working a little bit on both the e-voting and also on this idea of establishing a European digital election pass. So I think that they should ask questions that would be helpful for the development of our concept paper. Do you agree?
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor, thank you for giving me the floor. Actually, I was about to ask a question. Given the example of the Estonian case and the X-Road database that Estonia has implemented, I was wondering if there would be a possibility to have a European election digital pass. So, yeah, so that's what, because as we know, as we were saying, citizens would like to be more involved in the process, and voting, I think, is one of the options they can have to be heard, and also because that means that they will have the possibility to be part of the system. So I was thinking that we were thinking that the electional digital pass it is not only a naive idea of eradicating the whole concept of democratic deficit, but simply to address a practical problem with just very simple remedies in order to deal with the involuntary voting abstentionism. So if you want, I can share my screen very quickly with the bullet points I prepared. Let me share it. Okay. So just quickly, I will skip all the first part. And I will just talk about this proposal. So what could be the benefits? The digitalization of voter cards and electoral rolls with implementing a digital electoral certificate to replace traditional paper voter cards. This innovation will use, I think, that can use similar technologies to the one used for the Green Pass. So it's not something new. And then also benefits for voters. With the election pass can be downloaded to smartphones or printed out, and also the possibility to lose the card would be eliminated, and also would facilitate the new voting methods, especially like for example, in Italy, we are not allowed to vote in another city where we study or where we work, but we have to come back to the town where we have the residence. So maybe this the system, the implementation, a new database, a national or European database, can then favor or enhance new form of voting methods. So yes, then also there will be, of course, some challenges, but some of these challenges like digital divide, because not all countries have the same digital technological development. Also the risk of cybersecurity, but some of these have been overcome in similar initiatives like the Green Pass, which is similar to our proposal in terms of interoperability across member states, creating a standardized digital electoral pass that works across all European members, but also to have a cross-border legal and administrative coordination between countries.
So, Nora, that sounds
yes.
We have 10 more minutes for the whole debate, so maybe someone else would like to come in. I really encourage you, or to put, as you were already informed, questions in the chat, in the Q&A. Are there any questions? If not, I would encourage another student to take the floor.
If I may, in the waiting for any questions to be formulated, just to react to, both the encouragement of, in some sense, linking evidence-based to imagination, that of course has to be thought in that way. In a sense, evidence is not just strict, something that imprison us or limit us in our thinking, but that could be the basis for further elaborating, options that were not since the very beginning on the table. And in this sense, I really thank you, Franziska Meyer, that indeed was stressing the limitation that in some sense we know very well from the literature that is linked to this strong investment that also has been done by the European Commission in its position of being the engine of policy formulation with consultations that to some extent remain really very limited in just a few and very selected number of participants, and that, I mean, cannot be helpful in the direction that we are discussing about. So I was thinking in his day, if, for instance, symbols matter, and even to react to what Joe was saying about the necessity of strengthening the feeling of belongings and of feeling as in a community. I mean, more stress in this community dimension that possibly is the missing link in making people think into, I mean, in a positive way about politics in general. What about if we launch the idea of making the European election day a national holiday for all the European citizens? I mean, that is something that possibly could link us a little bit more, encouraging, reflection about what is going to be celebrated all over the member states' territories. So just I mean, a few things, but why not? I mean, this is done in the US in a number of states, so why not in the European Union member states?
Talking about inspiration, Francesco, you would like to ask something.
Well, there's also Calypso, but in fact, I just wanted to say to Calypso that I have an idea for applying the democratic odyssey in Siena. We can probably do an experimentation with real citizens, with real people, very real. So we will talk about that. Now, on one thing, something that John said before, which is very important. It's which is not a very new sort of objection. Joe said, well, I'm not sure that the citizens want to be involved into politics, which is fair enough. However, I would argue that people that want to get involved must have the right to do it, must have the mean to do it, no? And this is, I'm saying this especially considering the young people, if as a young person, I'm not exactly young, but if as a young person, I have I use technology to express myself. When I talk with friends, when I interact with friends to make some form of collective decision, I should be allowed to use that technology even when I express myself. If as a person, because today even the concept of citizenship is getting complicated. If as a person, as a citizen, and this applies very much to me, I happen to have my friends distributed in all European countries, and I want to, as an elector or even as a potential candidate, be part of a transnational list, I must have the right to have that kind of citizenship and form of participating to a community which is getting more diverse within. So, John, you are right. Not everybody wants to join politics, but who wants to do it should have the right because of a very basic principle of democracy. Sorry, Calypso, yeah.
It's good to, sorry. Yeah, no, it's good to hear that you have plans for Siena and involving young people, which is what we all try to do for so long, but it's not so easy. And it was lovely to hear of Sabrina's student, forget your name now, but on the election pass, We had collected a lot of such wonderful ideas in our report, SEP's report on the radicality of sunlight. And so I also wanted to echo you, Francesco, in addressing both Joe and Francesca's great comments. But I mean, perhaps with the angle of Joe's great provocation, I mean, real good provocation of what really matters is a sense of togetherness, of community, etc. And so I would give three kind of directions for reply, Joe, and using some of what Francesca said. So first of all, Francesco, those who want to get involved, I used to call this the democratic panopticon, that we, just like the Bentham, guardian of prison, who can see everyone in a circle, we need a people where some of the people get involved on some of the issues some of the time if they want. And that means that those who take decisions know that they're watched. They don't know when, how, and by whom. And this is not just, and this is done through many different ways, through the digital pathways that we were talking about, through indeed citizens' assemblies also. And Francisca, you're so right, the issue of inclusiveness is really important, not just for the sake of the assemblies. We're thinking a lot about this. How do you reach out very deep? But for the sake of the porousness of these assemblies, which don't really mean anything if they're little islands isolated in the ether. So that's one reasoning. Secondly, then, more broadly than that, and indeed for the, Joe, you're so right. What we need is an ethos out there in our polities where people feel, and some of us call it the democratic infrastructure or the democratic ideal and ethos. There are many different ways in which this is talked about. Maybe it's all about democratic social imaginaries, which means that if people, wherever they find themselves, neighborhoods or before in their schools, firms, etc., stuff is decided democratically. It's a very, very old social democratic principle, and in fact, leftist principle. But workers decide in their organization. But put into that the randomness principle, because or else it's always self-selected leadership. So if you mix that, the old, very, very, very old progressive theme of participation with random selection, you can do things. And indeed, people who get this sense of community, need to find ways and channels to translate their preferences, what they want their community to achieve, and their grievances with the political sphere. And you really need this ethos, as well as linking different local senses of community. Translocalism is very important. So in that sense, citizen assembly play a role among several. And that leads me to the third element, which is that, it's not, when we talk about citizen engagement in politically through assemblies or citizen initiative, of course, it's not a magic wand, and it needs to be part of a holistic approach to renewing democracy. This is why the electoral pass is so important. This is why I don't agree with some people in the community of deliberative democracy who think that's going to be the answer to everything. No, we need to renew electoral democracy. We need to renew direct democracy and think about ways of connecting them, which is why, Joe, your point about the Economic and Social Committee, and I would link it to the Committee of the Region, is so important. They're existing institutions, but they haven't found their 21st century kind of raison d'etre. I think if these two EU institutions work together and with the European Parliament to create, this permanent citizen assembly, that would bolster their own role. And indeed, again, echoing Francesca, I so agree with you, Francesca, that we need to ask citizens how they imagine the future of Europe more generally, not just issue by issue. That's why we need to have citizens do agenda setting, monitoring and accountability of governments, in addition to these much more specific policy issues, including high stakes, including war and peace. Of course, these are key issues, and we're not asking. We need to democratize foresight, democratize foreign policy, and do it through many different instruments. That's what we're all thinking about.
Thanks, Calypso. Yeah, our time is actually up, and you probably have dinner ready or children to take care of, right, Joe? I saw someone there. Yeah, I'll hand the final words to Francesco. Maybe you want to say a few things about where we are going from here until Siena, and then I'll say a good night to all of you.
Okay, Sabrina, you want to say something urgent? Are you happy with the webinar?
Yes, I took a number of notes, so I think that we have food for thought, so therefore we'll further elaborate.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the links. The next webinar will be on sustainable finance, will be on the 17th of June at 6 o'clock again, with John Cooper, the correspondent from The Economist, as chair, and Daniel Gross from IAP Bocconi, and we will have the tutor Costanza, who is still here, I suppose, among the spectators, Costanza Consolanti, and then we will have other two webinars and on the road to Siena that will happen from the 12th to the 15th of September. So thank you very much. It was really great as a first seminar. Thank you, and thanks, a big thank to Alexandra.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye bye.